In this video, we are going to create this animation with pure HTML and CSS, but of course feel free to recreate it with Tailwind, CSS in JS, React, Svelte, Vue, whatever you like. The full source code for this video is available and the link is in the video description, and I also linked a blog post that I created that covers this very subject with interactive widgets that helps you memorize these concepts better. If you find this video useful, I'll be very grateful if you would kindly consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Enough of the intro, let's jump into the video. Before we're going to jump into the animation, we are going to learn about how to create these texts with gradient backgrounds that's going to serve us as a basis for creating the animation. To get started, we're gonna scaffold out some HTML real quick. I'm gonna do this basic HTML boilerplate. I'm gonna download a custom font that I really like. I'm gonna give the body some basic style, so that's like background, some padding, reset the margin, set the font family, set the font smoothing to anti-alias and grayscale. That's important because that's gonna render the fonts much smoother. And similar thing goes for H1, reset the margin, set the font size, set the font weight, set the color to white, and finally letter spacing to -0.03. Let's proceed with the boring stuff and add a new class called heading line. That's gonna be for each of the lines of the heading. Let's add line height 1, display block, set position to relative. That's gonna be important in very near future when we'll be absolutely positioning some pseudo elements. And let's set text align to center to make the text nicely centrally aligned. Next, we're gonna jump into HTML. We're gonna wrap everything in a H1 tag, and each line is going to correspond to one span. The first one's gonna say animated. It's gonna have the class heading line. That's the class that we've just created. And it's also going to have the heading line first class, which we'll use to give each of the lines a different gradient color. And we'll do the same for the second line. It's gonna say gradient, and the third line, it's gonna say text. We can now hit save and view our changes in the browser, and we'll see that we've got the basic skeleton we're gonna use for the animation. And this was the boring part. Now it's just going to be the fun stuff. The time has finally come and we can apply the gradient background. We're gonna first apply it to the first line, and we're gonna use the background image property, and the gradient is applied using linear gradient. We're gonna set the direction to left, and then we can use whatever colors we like. I'm gonna use these colors because I like these colors, and we're gonna use the same thing for the second line and the third line. And yes, we could use something like nth child selector, but I decided to make things really simple and just use this really dumb method. If we preview the changes we've done so far, it's sort of the opposite of what we want to achieve. The gradient background is applied to everything but the text bit. But what we want is the gradient background to only appear within the text bit. We can fix it with 2 lines of CSS. The first one of the 2 CSS lines, or properties rather, is color transparent. That's going to remove the white color and make the text see-through so that you can see the gradient background. And the second one is going to be background clip to text. That's going to clip the background so that it's only applied to the text bit and not the entire rectangle. And we also need to use WebKit-background clip because of poor browser support for the CSS property. If we now preview the changes in the browser, we can see it work, and the first part is done. Next, we're gonna get things moving and we're gonna animate what we just created. So in this part, we are going to be focusing on animating the gradient background, and in the following part, we actually animate the white background as well, and it will actually make a huge difference, so stay tuned until the end of the video. But now, without further ado, let's talk about how to animate the gradient background. So before we jump into CSS and the actual code, I think it's very helpful to create a plan as for what we want to animate, and then it will be much easier for for us to actually turn it into code. So if you think about it, the first thing that you want your user to see when the page is rendered is something like this, and I'll be using the screenshots from my blog during this part. So the first thing that user sees is that the first word, the first line, it has the gradient background, and the other two lines, they've got white backgrounds, and it stays like this for a little while. And then the next step is that the first line, it starts fading out, and the second line, it starts fading in. So like when it's halfway through, it will look something like this, where it's like half white background, half gradient background. The same goes for the second line. And finally, when the animation is finished, or when the first part of the animation is finished, it's gonna look like this. Only the second line is gonna have the gradient background, and the remaining ones, they're gonna have the white background. And again, for a bit, it's gonna stay like this. And you can actually see how it works with this, if you play with this widget that I created just for this purpose. And it's on my blog, so feel free to check it out. And as I drag the slider, you can see that the first heading is slowly fading out, the second is slowly fading in, then it stays like this for a bit, where only the second line has the gradient background, and after a while it starts fading out and the third one starts fading in, and it stays like this for a while. And finally, it goes back to the initial state where the first line has the gradient background and the other two ones have white backgrounds. So if you deep what we just talked about down, it sort of means that we need to divide the animation into 6 different parts. And why is that the case? Why 6 different parts? Well, in each part of the animation can be either it can be in 2 states essentially. So the first state is the state where one heading has gradient background and the other ones, they've got white backgrounds. And the other state after a while is that one heading is fading out and the other one is fading in. And these 2 states, they go for all 3 of the lines. So 3 times 2, that's 6. And we can actually turn it into this table that will serve us as a basis for creating our keyframes, our animation in CSS. So we see part number 1, heading number 1 has gradient, heading number 2 and 3, they've got no gradient. The second part, the first heading is fading out, the second one is fading in, the third one it stays with no gradient, and the third bit is no gradient for the first heading, gradient for the second heading, and no gradient for the third heading. That would correspond to this state, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think you get the idea, but it's essential to create this sort of table. I mean, not essential, but it will make your life very easy when creating the keyframes later on. So now that we've actually got this understanding of what we want to do, we can jump into CSS, and I'm sure it will be a breeze. Let's jump into the code editor now, and the key property we're going to be animating is the opacity property. So if the opacity is set to 1, then the gradient is going to be visible, and when the opacity is set to 0, then the gradient is not going to be visible. Think about what happens if we set opacity to 0 though. If you set opacity to 0, then essentially there will be nothing on the screen, because there is nothing underneath the heading if it doesn't have the gradient background. So we'll need to include a white background underneath it, and in order to do that, we first have to wrap the headings in an additional span. So we'll wrap the first heading line in a span. It's going to have class heading line gradient, and we're going to do the same for the second line and the third line, and then we'll hit save. So this heading line gradient is actually now going to have the gradient background, and then we'll apply a pseudo before element on the heading line, and it's going to have the white background, and we'll make it so that the white background is underneath the gradient background. Now we want to actually move the gradient background styles onto this newly created heading line gradient class. So we're gonna create a class in our CSS definition real quick, and we're gonna copy these styles that are specific to the gradient background from heading line class onto the newly created heading line gradient class, and we are going to move these background image linear gradient styles to be applied to the heading line gradient. So we're just gonna copy this real quick and we're gonna change these. And I want to target the first child of the heading line first. That's of the class heading line gradient. I'm gonna hit save and I'm gonna go back to the browser. I'm gonna hit refresh. Everything still looks good. Now let's add the styles for the white background, and we're gonna start by targeting the before pseudo element of the heading dash line class. We're gonna add line height 1, display block, position absolute, color white obviously, point events none, and width 100%. And then we're gonna target each of the lines individually and we're gonna apply content to them. So the first line is gonna say animated, the second line, the pseudo element of the second line is gonna say gradient, and the third one is gonna say text, so that it actually matches the HTML structure. And now let's jump into the actual animation. We are first going to define keyframes for the first line of the heading, and the keyframes property allows us to specify how different CSS properties are going to look like in different stages on the animation. So let's say like the first 10% it's gonna look like this, the next 50% is gonna look like this, and so on and so forth. Let's use the table that we created as a reference, and it will help us to actually put the animation together. So if we focus on the second column, that's for heading number 1, it says that part number 1, it should have a gradient. So it means that the first part of the 6, it should be opacity 1, and we have to work in percentages here. So we're gonna specify that from 0%, the beginning, to 1/6 of the animation. That corresponds to 16.67%. The opacity is going to be 1. And then we want the first heading to start fading out, so that's gonna correspond to opacity 0, but we don't want to apply this immediately from 16.67%, but we want a gradual fade out, so only here we've got no gradient. So this means that from 33%, that's 2/6, all the way to 83.333%, that's part number 5, that's 5/6. We want to have no gradient, that corresponds to opacity 0, but we're not done yet, because if you take a look at the table, the last bit is we want the gradients to start fading in again as the animation ends, or as the animation cycle ends. So if it gets to 100%, we want the opacity to be 1 again. Let's now apply the animation. So we'll use the animation property. We'll apply the name of the animation, set the duration to 8 seconds, and send the number of repetitions to infinite, so that the animation just keeps going on repeat. And we can now save what we have. We can go to the browser, and you can actually see that the first heading is animating. Obviously the second and third headings, they are white during the entire duration of the animation, but we'll fix that in a bit. Now it's time to define the keyframes for the second line and the third line of the heading, and I won't be going into as much detail as I did for the first one, because it's mainly the same thing over again, just like different numbers, and you can use the table that we have to create these yourselves, and in fact I highly encourage you to do so. It's the best way to learn. So we'll define the second heading as follows. We'll name it second heading gradient, and from 0% to 16% it's gonna have opacity 0, so it will start with the white background, then it's gonna go to the gradient background, and then it's gonna go back to the white background. And I'll do a similar thing for the third heading. So the name is gonna be third heading gradient. It's gonna start off being white, then it's gonna have the gradient background, and it's gonna go back to being white. Finally, we can apply these keyframes onto the second gradient and onto the third gradient. And if you go to the browser and hit refresh, and it's actually working. But don't quit the video just yet. In the next and last part, we're gonna learn how to add a bit more spice to it so that the animation really stands out. let's take a proper look at the final product that we're aiming for, and that's this animation. And I'm using my blog post as a reference once again. And if you really pay attention to what's going on in this animation, you can see that the white background is animating as well, and it's fading out as the gradient is fading in, and vice versa, it's fading in as the gradient is fading out. But it's not the case through the entire duration of the animation. It's just the first bit of the fade out of the gradient and the last bit of the fade in of the gradient, and it's a lot to digest, so I'll use this little widget that I created to demonstrate what I mean by it. So this is the initial state of the animation. The first heading, it has gradient background, and as I move this slider, you can see that the white text, the white background, has initial opacity 0, the gradient text has initial opacity of 1, and as I move the slider, the white background is fading in, so the opacity is approaching 1, but at much faster pace than the gradient text is fading out. So when I'm halfway through, the white text has already been animated, whereas the gradient text is just halfway through the animation. And as I continue moving the slider, the animation finishes like that. How do we translate this to CSS actually? Well, the first step is going to be to create a table that's going to actually tell us what we want to do in CSS. And do not get overwhelmed by this, because now we have 12 steps. And why is that the case? Well, it's because the animation of the white background only takes half the time of the animation of the gradient background, so that's why we've got twice as much steps now. And this is just the table for the first heading only, and yeah, I know it's a bit overwhelming, but if you want to achieve a very nice and unique user experience, that's what you gotta do, sadly. So what does this table tell us actually? This first column is the gradient opacity. It's for the first heading only, so it's gonna look kind of similar to the first column of the first table. And this column, it tells us the opacity of the white background. So you can see the first part, it corresponds to the state where we see the gradient background. So the gradient opacity is going to be 1, white background opacity is going to be 0. Then the second part is that the gradient is starting to fade out and the white background is starting to fade in. In the third step, and this is essential, the gradient is still fading out, whereas the white background has already faded in. And the fourth step is the gradient has faded out and the white background is already faded in at this point, but it was the case one step earlier. And the same goes for when the gradient is starting to fade in. So in the first stage, it's only the gradient that's being animated, and only as the gradient is halfway faded in, the white background animation kicks in and the white background starts fading out. We can now translate the table into CSS, so let's define some keyframes. We're gonna name it first heading white text, and the first 2 parts out of 12, the white heading, the white background of the first heading is going to have opacity 0. Then from the second part all the way to the 11th part, so all the way to almost the end, the opacity is going to be 1, so the white background is going to be visible, and only at the very end of the animation cycle we want to make the white background go away again. So we're going to set the opacity to 0, and these percentages, they just correspond to different parts out of 12 parts, so that's why these numbers are somewhat odd, but it just maths at the end of the day. And we can apply the animation that we just created onto the before pseudo element of the first line of the heading. And if you go to the browser, we'll be able to see that the first heading is animating in a much nicer way. So there's a little bit more spice to it now. Now you can see that before it fades out or fades in, there is this little bit of a flash. So that's what we just did, and that's what we're gonna do for the second and third heading shortly. So let's create the keyframes for the second heading and the third heading for the white backgrounds of these headings. So we're gonna start off by creating the keyframes for the second one. So it's gonna start off as being visible, and these exact percentages I won't go into that much detail when it comes to how to come up with them. The process is very similar to the first heading, so I won't bore you with these details, but you can try to come up with these yourself before watching the rest of the video. That's always the best way to learn. So the second heading is gonna start off as being visible, and then the white background's gonna go away, and then it's gonna fade in again. And a similar thing applies for the third heading. So it's gonna start off as being visible, then it's gonna fade out and fade back in. We are now going to apply those animations with the very same settings as for the remaining animations, and we can now go to the browser, and you can now see that the animation is finally behaving as expected. So we've now achieved what we wanted, and that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you very much for watching this video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video and find it useful. If you did, I would highly appreciate if you'd kindly consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. And as always, I appreciate any feedback, whether it's positive or negative. It helps me improve the quality of the videos. The source code for what the video covered is available in the video description, as well as the link to the blog post that I created that covers this very subject. And with that, thank you, and hopefully see you next time. Bye.